Welcome back to the Pursuit Podcast. I'm your host, Jessica Rose. Every episode in May, we're going to be joined by a guest talking to us about a different aspect of funding your company or funding your project within technology. And the Pursuit Podcast is also very happy to welcome our own first sponsor to help us fund the podcast itself. We're joined by Neximo as our first sponsor. Neximo helps developers add SMS, voice and calls, authentication, and a lot of other really interesting tooling into their workflows and into their products. If you wanted to find out more about what Neximo does, going to www.neximo.com is probably the best way to learn more. If you wanted to say thank you to Neximo or to get in touch with their community, hopping on Twitter and going to @NeximoDev is probably the best way to say hi. Let's jump right in with our guest. I'm here today with
Danielle Robinson, the co-executive director of Code for Science and Society.
How exciting! Science and society and code. Danielle, I'm here today to talk to you about getting funding via grants. I was wondering if you could talk to me a little bit about what your organization does and what your experience with grants has been to date.
Sure. So Code for Science and Society is a 501c3 nonprofit, and we do a couple of things. We run programs. We have a program called the Collaborative Communities Program, and that's a program where we work with communities who want to make the most of the collaborative tools that exist. And honestly, mostly we help them with people problems, not really software problems. But just to try to bring expertise from that may be developed in, say, the civic tech domain and bring that over to scientific research. So that's one program. Another thing we do is build software, and that's our foundational technology program. We build open source software, mostly focused on sharing information, and we're pretty excited about peer-to-peer and decentralized approaches to do that. And then the third thing we do is sponsor projects. So as a 501c3, if, for example, a person based in another country or a person has an idea for a project, but they don't want to incorporate their own nonprofit, and there are a lot of reasons why incorporating a nonprofit is not a choice that you might want to make right away, we can help that person accept grant funding from a philanthropy or a government grant or another type of grant. And we take a percentage, and then they get the rest of the money and administer their project. So an example of that is Stencilla, which is one of our sponsored projects. They're funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. And so we also, beyond just financial administration, we work with them on writing more grants and strategy and help connect them to resources they might need.
So it sounds like a solid third of the work you do is about helping source and helping administer grants.
Yeah, it's all about the grants.
And you do this not just in the US, but in international markets and with international grants as well?
So right now, let me think. Most of our funding sources so we sponsor 3 projects: the DAT project, Stencilla, and a project called Science Fair. Science Fair is based in the UK and EU, as is some of their funding, but the other projects are all US based. So I just want to say that I'm in Texas and there's a giant thunderstorm. So some of the crashing noises that you hear might be that.
No worries. So if our dear listener hasn't had any interaction with grants to date, where would you recommend people start? So if you were looking to get some grant money in, how would you even start doing research?
Sure. So when I meet people who have an open source project and they're interested in exploring funding some of their work through grants, what I tell them to do is you want to see who's funding in your space. And I would recommend you do that by looking at other projects, looking at who's funded them in the past, and making a spreadsheet, because that's the best way to keep track of all this information. So that's step one. If you can identify a couple of funders who are interested in investing in the space where your project is going to make an impact, then you want to check out those funders, see what their priorities are, see if they might be funding other things or funding events or funding things that are related to you but in other domains. And then I think the idea is you want to do something called writing a one-pager, which is writing a one-page, what's the impact of this project and why should this funder care? And then you need to tap your networks and try to get an introduction. Figure out who's the program officer who's working in that space and try to get in the same room with them or on the phone with them. And that's when the pitching begins. And that's when you'll really get an understanding of what their priorities are and whether your project will overlap with their priorities.
So fantastic. It sounds like the first step is to look for other projects like you. You talked about having a one-pager to share with the folks who might want to give you money. What kinds of things should you include in this?
Sure. So that's a great question. And this is a question I get a lot because so I'm thinking about a colleague of mine has a really exciting project and somebody introduced her to a funder and they said, yeah, send over a one-pager. And she messages me like, I don't know what a one-pager is.
Yeah.
And I think it's really, really common, right? Because once you're in the space, you know what that is, but there's no template out there. And so I just want to comment that I'm working with a group called the Open Source Alliance for Open Scholarship. And we're doing something called a handbook hackathon over the summer where we're going to write all this stuff down and release all this information openly. So there will be a template for how to write a good one-pager that's going to be partially authored by Carly Strasser, who was a program officer at the Moore Foundation. Now she's at the COCO. So it will be written by people who know what these things are. But essentially, a one-pager introduces the idea of the project, talks about it in a language that will make sense to the funder, right? Like if you can get a sense of what the funder values and what kind of impact they want to make, you want to tell them why your project is going to make that impact. It's a little bit like a resume. It can be like a paragraph, some bullet points, and it doesn't need to go deep. It doesn't need to spell out exactly how much money you want. And I think it's worth noting that the program officers are the ones that I know are all fantastic people, and they are used to working with people who are new to this type of funding. So they will give you don't have to give them the perfect thing the first try, because there will be rounds of iteration. But the point is to get your ideas across and get quickly to how this is going to make the impact that the funder is seeking to make and how you're going to help them achieve their mission.
Fantastic. So it does sound like you should be not necessarily rewriting this completely for each grant you go to, but tailoring it a little bit like a resume.
Yeah.
Oh, I really care about this job. Let me go ahead and highlight the things I think this role cares about.
Yeah.
Or let me highlight the things that this grant organization cares about.
Yeah, every foundation has a mission, and that's part of the research phase, as you figure out who's funding in your space and what does each organization care about, what are their priorities. You want to check out their missions, see how they talk about themselves, and if you can try to understand how that overlaps with the work that you want to do, I think that is the best approach to take, because you definitely, we all get excited about our projects and the impact that they can have, but you need to speak in the language that the funder is speaking in, right? So if they're particularly interested in data in the digital humanities and you come at them with, data in another domain, they're going to say, that's great. And I think you should go talk to these other people, but that's not really in our wheelhouse. So you need to be specific about how you are going to be a great fit for them.
Fantastic. So really have a clear idea of what they care about and be like, oh, wow, I also really care about this thing that your organization's all about.
I also really care about this thing. And these are the ways we're already making impact in this space. And this is how we want to continue to do that. And we're seeking funding to launch this project. And a one-pager doesn't need to get into the details of the funding. It does need to talk about the impact. And some program officers may ask you specifically, or they may outline, like, this is the level at which we're interested. And so you can tailor it to that. But sometimes at the one-pager stage, you don't have that information. So the goal is to get your idea across and make sure they understand the impact. Because when you're in at least the American and European philanthropy world, all the program officers know each other, and they are, they're people and they have a community, they talk to each other. So if you're not the right fit for one person, but they can get the spark of your idea, they might be able to help introduce you to the organization that will be the right funder for you.
And this is really interesting. Last week, we talked to a CEO of a company who had gone for VC funding, and she had talked about how incredibly important it is to have a really firm number and to be able to back that up with why that number is important. So for grants, it sounds very much like just starting the conversation as the first step.
Yeah, that might be my approach versus their approach, but I think you need that firm number. You need to know what you need, but the relationship is developing the relationship is what's important. And so just making sure they have a clear sense of your idea. So I wouldn't say like, it's okay to have no idea what you need, but I would say it doesn't necessarily be the thing you're leading with, because you also never know. Each foundation has, they have their own cycle when a couple times a year when they'll meet and review grants. So you don't know where they are in that. You don't know if they have any kind of funding that doesn't need to go through the big cycle. Sometimes the lower amount grants, like if you were running an event, you might be able to sort of forego the big review process, propose an event that's under $50,000, say, and get that approved without waiting for the big meeting. So,
how exciting.
Yeah. So
how hypothetically exciting.
Hypothetically exciting. But getting an understanding of what's going on at a foundation that you're interested in working with is all about building the relationship. And I think it's important to know your numbers, and you absolutely need to know your numbers. But it's a different kind of for lack of a better word, it's a different kind of sales cycle, right? You're not... Yeah. I think it's worth noting that the fastest grant turnaround I've ever experienced has been 3 months. The longest is, a multi-year relationship that is still developing. And
wow, multi-year.
So, yeah, I mean, if you're operating in the civic tech or nonprofit tech space, you may just, you need to wait until your priorities are aligning with another person's priorities, and you keep talking to them and keep letting them know what you're doing. And even if it doesn't work right away, it doesn't mean it won't work in the future. But I think a typical sales cycle length for grant funding, I would say it's about 9 months from like, hey, I've got this idea, to a check in your bank account. So that is worth noting and worth thinking about as you're exploring how to get your idea funded. Is if you need money tomorrow, maybe this will work out, but it is also generally a little bit of a longer cycle.
So we've touched on your foundation and some open source projects that do take on grant funding. Can you talk to me a little bit about what kinds of companies or projects might best benefit from this kind of funding?
So I think grants are an excellent option for projects that are new and just getting off the ground and exciting. So funders are really interested in innovative ways to make impact. And if you are starting something, so right now I'm thinking about a project called Pre-Review, which it's more of a community project, an open access, open scholarship community project that encourages scientists and scholars to review preprints and then send the feedback to the authors. And they're looking at grant funding. It's a super exciting project. But what they're doing is a very public benefit thing, right? It's not going to be that exciting for investors. It's very exciting, though, to people who are in the open access, open data, open scholarship space. And there are a lot of funders who are committed to those ideas. So if you have an idea that needs that initial seed funding to make an impact in a space, and then you can start developing business models and diversifying how you bring in revenue to support the project down the line, I think grants are a great option. There are a lot of ideas that are going to be really important for scientific computing, or really important for civic tech or privacy and security. And these ideas are in line with things that funders are interested in, but they're also sometimes, I don't know how to say this without sounding like a jerk, but sometimes investors might be like, oh, sure, yeah, scientific computing, that's a pretty small market. So developing a company could be not the right choice to do right away. Right.
So it sounds a little bit like, if you think this is something that can be profit driven, if you think you could really grow it, yeah, go for other funding approaches. But if you're really in this for sort of the long haul, you're in here to do real good, and you're a lot less worried about scaling or reaching 1 million users or disrupting the market, that it might be a really good space for a grant.
I think grant funded projects do disrupt the market, and there is an interesting... Funders can take risks in a way that investors would be unlikely to do, right? And so that's one of the reasons that the DAT project has been funded by philanthropy for most of its existence. It's a fundamental rethink of the way data are handled. And I think, the DAT project's major use cases are public benefit use cases, making public data accessible, making open data really easy to download and remix, we are the foundation of the Beaker browser, which is a peer-to-peer web browser, and they really foreground like creator control of content and data. And that stuff is pretty outside of it's a little bit riskier, and maybe there would have been a path for that project to take on investment and become a for-profit. But funders were ready to invest in this technology at its beginnings, and we've really grown because of those investments. And so I think it's not that it needs to be a boring project that's not disruptive, but I think that you need to be working in a way that is usually for some kind of a public benefit, because that's what most philanthropies are set up to do.
If our listener is someone who's working in a tech for good space, or they've got this fantastic idea, and they're just absolutely going to change the world in a way that's meaningfully important for the greater social good, get involved, like apply for grants.
Yeah, I think they should. Yeah, if a person has a project as you're describing, I think they should start doing research, see where their project might fit into the broader ecosystem. And, I don't believe that there is a right way or a wrong way to do open source sustainability. If you can get your project to be sustainable, then you're doing it right, because it's a challenge for everyone. And I think grants can be a part of that for a project that may be also doing client work or also running a service.
Fantastic. So you gave us some really great sort of very high level advice on here's what it looks like to start engaging with grants and the organizations who give them. Here's the kind of ways to do research. But I was wondering if you could talk to me about the first time you applied for a grant, and maybe looking back, what you wish you had known then.
Sure. So I come from an academic background. I have a PhD in neuroscience. And so the first time I applied for a grant, I was, a first-year PhD student, and I applied for a couple of grants, and I got one, and I didn't get some others. And I think through that process, I learned a couple of things. I learned that for some funders, it's more about investing in the person. For other funders, it's all about investing in the project. And for most funders, it's probably a combination of the two, right? You need the right person who can do the work, and you need a killer idea that's going to make impact in the space, make the world a better place. And I think I learned something early on about how to make sure I was developing as much of an understanding as I could about what a funder's priorities are, and making sure that they knew how I was going to help them get to their priorities and meet their goals, and making it really easy for them to see that in my application. Because one thing I think I didn't think about when I was initially applying for grants is that the people who will be reviewing them are reviewing all kinds of grants, and you need to make it easy for them to find the information and make your grant stand out a little bit. Another thing I learned is about getting as many people as possible to review my writing and take in the heavy edits, because if you're not used to writing this kind of document, your first pass is probably not going to be a work of staggering genius, and that's okay.
Oh, no.
You will get there.
Okay.
So I think just using all your resources, if you know people who've gotten funding before, reach out to them, say, can you review this? I know you're really busy.
A lot of the first steps to these are like, go make friends.
Yeah.
So like, go make friends with other people who get grants, go make friends with the people who administer, just go outside or go online, whatever suits you best, and really start networking in meaningful ways.
Yeah. So I'm in the middle of reading a book that I'm going to pitch to your audience. It's called Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. And she's a community organizer and an activist and a doula and a million other things based in Detroit. And one of the things that she writes about in this book, which is also inspired by the works of Octavia Butler. So I was like, yeah, it's a great book. And one of the many very smart, genius things that she says in this book is that everything is all about relationships. Work moves at the speed of trust. So you can have a great idea, but you need to build the relationships and establish the trust if you want your idea to come to fruition. And so that's something that was really impactful for me when I was reading her work. And I think it's super important in a lot of spaces. It's all about the relationships, and it's about understanding what you want to work for and how you can find people who want to work for the same thing. So that's, if it sounds like I'm saying that, it's because I am, because I think it's true.
Fantastic. One of the most interesting things is just you. So have you seen that we do sketch notes of each episode? So a graphic representation.
No.
I love it because the
so cool.
Octavia Butler reference definitely gives us an excuse to hide some tentacles somewhere in the art.
I'm down with that.
Can you talk to me a little bit about sort of what the most challenging things or what some of the most frustrating things about sourcing funding through grants can be?
Well, I think that everyone who wants to sustain an open source project knows that funding is always an issue for many projects. And I think it can be frustrating for a project lead who's got a great idea and just hasn't found the right way to sustain it. That's obviously very hard. Foundations and government agencies and people who give grants also change their priorities sometimes, or they'll go through a period where they're re-examining what they're doing and they're not able to fund. And I think that can be hard for everyone as you wait to see what the new priorities are going to be. But that's okay. That's just part of the process. And finding funding is always hard, however you're going to do it. And this is just another type of ecosystem to learn about, relationships to make, and a project that has a good idea and a meaningful way to impact the world is going to find a home. It just is a matter of time.
I love how a lot of your advice on getting involved with folks that have experience and making contacts sounded a lot like make friends. And this advice sounds like, well, there are some challenges, but you need to take a very Zen approach to the whole thing.
Yeah, sometimes I think I'm trying to be like project therapy for people. So it can be frustrating, but if it's where you are, it's where you are. And you just need to work through it and stay focused on your idea and what you can do. But I recognize that it's super hard.
You've given us some really fantastic advice on what to look for in applying for grants, how you might want to be able to go out and try to do some of these things. So really fantastic, really solid advice. What I'd love to know is, what would you like to warn us against? What are some things you've seen people do in applying for grants, or maybe things you've heard of second or third hand that you just want to scream, no?
Yeah, so I think that what I've seen new project leads do is undervalue their own time when they apply for grants. So sometimes when I've reviewed a new grant application for somebody, they will not pay themselves a full salary.
Oh, no.
Or they will say, I can take 50% salary because I want to use the rest of that to hire a team of developers. And I think that is, a noble move. But for most funders, the difference between paying you half salary and paying you four salaries, not four salaries.
Four salaries would be pretty excited. I'm down for that.
Four salaries would be exciting. But half salary and a full salary is not impactful to them. And what's important to you and your project is that you don't get burned out. Because if you're starting up an open source project and you want to be in it for the long haul and make this work sustainable, you need to be able to pay your bills and you need to be not stressed out about money. So I would encourage people who are looking for funding to not undervalue their time and make sure that when they're setting up their project proposals, that they are being thoughtful about what is this really going to take? Not, what's the shoestring that I can do this on, but what's it going to take to do this right and set it up for success? Another thing I've seen is sometimes a project will staff up really quickly, and if that happens because they get a big infusion of funding, and that's great. But if your project gets in that situation, it's super important to see the the drop-off point coming, because maybe that's a 1-year grant. And so I would encourage a project lead in that situation to take advantage of being able to staff up and get a bunch of contractors on to do a lot of work, but plan for the future and don't plan that you will have another grant immediately in the bag by the time this one ends, because that might not happen. And it's super important, for open source sustainability generally, you want to think about how can I set this project up to run without a team of 10 people, because that might happen in times, because there are ups and downs on these cycles. So I guess those are the two things: value your time and always be planning for a future where you might not have the same resources that you have today.
And I think these are very, very good general advice. It's not sustainable if it's not sustainable for you.
Yeah.
And money isn't guaranteed.
Yeah, especially in, open source for public benefit type of projects.
Danielle, it's been wonderful to get to chat to you. Thank you so much. Where can people find more about Code for Science, or where can they find you online if they want to come and ask you more questions?
Sure. I'd be happy to talk to anyone with all of my extra spare time. Just kidding. I love talking to people. I am quite busy, but you can find me on Twitter at Danielle C. Robins, and you can find Code for Science and Society at Code for Society on Twitter. And all of those things link out to our websites. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
And thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to keep up with what we're doing at the Pursuit Podcast, you can find us on Twitter at Pursuit Pod. We'll see you next Tuesday with a brand new episode.